Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar today. The topic for this webinar is FERC Order 841, Leveling the Playing Field for Energy Storage Resource Market Participation. This webinar is being presented by the Clean Energy States Alliance as part of the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, otherwise known as STap. STap is managed by CISA and is supported by the U.S. Department of Energy and Sandia National Laboratories. And we'll talk a bit more about the STap project in a moment, and I'll also pass it over to our excellent guest speakers that we have with us today from Customized Energy Solutions and to our host for this webinar. But before any of that, I'd like to go over a few quick housekeeping notes. So you have a couple of options to join the audio portion of the webinar today. You can call in using a telephone, or you can connect using computer mic and speakers. If you'd like to expand or minimize the webinar control panel so that you can view the slides full screen, you can click on that little orange arrow that we have circled there. A very important note, we ask that you please submit your questions and comments throughout the webinar by typing them into the question box on the webinar console and hitting send. We will get to as many questions as we can. We're going to save about 15 minutes for Q&A with the guest speakers at the end of the webinar, but we do expect to have a lot of people on the line today, so that should mean a lot of questions. In order to make sure that we get to your question, type it in when you think of it. Don't wait until the very end. And a final note, this webinar is being recorded. We will send you a follow-up email within about 48 hours with a link to a webinar recording and a copy of the webinar slides as a PDF. And we'll also be posting those materials on our website at cisa.org/webinars. And at that web link, you can find all of our previous webinars and our upcoming webinars as well. So with that out of the way, I would like to pass it over to our host for today's webinar, Todd Olinsky-Paul. Todd is a project director at the Clean Energy States Alliance, and he is going to get us started today. Todd?
Thanks very much, Samantha, and welcome everybody to this webinar. This is an STap webinar, and I'll explain that in just a minute. But first, I'd like to do a little bit of background on Clean Energy States Alliance. For those not familiar, we are a nonprofit located in Vermont, and essentially we are a membership organization of state clean energy funds, and you can see the logos of our members there on the screen. We've been doing this for 15 years. We basically help state energy funds and energy officials in state agencies to get information and analysis to more efficiently run their programs and communicate among one another about various strategies and methods for running clean energy programs. So that's CISA, and I'm going to attempt to advance the slide here. There we go. So I mentioned this is an STap webinar. STap is the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership. CISA manages STap under contract with Sandia National Laboratories, and it's a program funded by the U.S. Department of Energy Office of Electricity. We'd like to thank Dr. Emery Zook at US DOE OE for supporting our work in energy storage, and also we'd like to thank Dan Borneo at Sandia National Laboratories. What we do in STap, aside from webinars such as this one, of which we do produce many, but aside from that, we work to bring states into partnership with DOE and the National Lab to produce and collaborate on energy storage deployment. And typically we focus in STAP on larger scale energy storage, megawatt scale projects, more or less. As you can see by the map there, we are working on projects all over the country. Some of those markers on the map indicate not projects but state policy efforts, because the other thing that we do is that we work with state energy agencies departments of public utility, regulatory agencies, and so forth, to help them develop energy storage programs and policy. So, having said all that, I would like to introduce our speakers and tell you a little bit about what we're doing today. This webinar is going to be taking a deep dive into FERC Order 841, which was recently announced and will have or should have great impacts on markets for energy storage in the FERC regulated territories across the country. And when I say FERC regulated, I'm talking about the ISO and RTO areas where there are wholesale energy markets that fall under FERC regulatory structures. So we're going to hear about FERC 841. There'll be a little bit of context and background on the preceding FERC orders, and there'll be some discussion about how this new order is likely to impact markets and what various ISOs will need to do to come into compliance with it. And that's going to vary depending on which ISO you're talking or RTO you're talking about. The first voice you will hear after mine is Mike Berlinski's. Mike is Director of Emerging Technologies at Customized Energy Solutions. He assists clients with market intelligence, analysis, and consulting on energy storage and emerging technologies. Then we will hear from Jacqueline DeRosa. She's the Vice President of Emerging Technologies at Customized Energy Solutions, where she leads a team of experts that helps utilities, developers, technology providers, and financial institutions understand the market rules and value proposition of energy storage. We're also going to be hearing from Patrick Shoop, Manager of Emerging Technologies, again at Customized Energy Solutions. Patrick manages consulting projects and market intelligence on energy storage, distributed energy resources, and other emerging energy technologies. There will be quite a bit of switching back and forth between our presenters as they hand off to each other to explain various aspects of today's presentation. And after they're done, as usual, we will be answering as many of your questions as we can get to. Please don't wait until the end. If you have a question or a comment to make as the presentation proceeds, please go ahead and type it into the question console, and that way we'll have them queued up and ready to go at the end of the presentation. Okay, thanks very much. And with that, I will now hand it off to Mike Berlinski.
Great, thanks, Todd. Mike Berlinski here. First, thank you to Clean Energy States Alliance and STap for having this webinar series and inviting us to be part of it. We love talking about energy storage, so we're very excited to be here today. I'll go over quickly our agenda, and then we'll get into our presentation. So first, we want to just give a brief overview of Customized Energy Solutions so you know who we are and why we love to talk about energy storage. And then we really want to help people understand what FERC Order 841 is, how did we get here, and what does it mean for the future. So first, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Jackie, to give a brief overview of CES.
Well, thank you, Mike, and thank you again, Todd and Sam. We are grateful for the opportunity with Clean Energy States Alliance, and thanks to the Office of Electricity as well. Customized Energy Solutions, we've been around for a long time, since 1998, and we're privately owned, and we're headquartered in Philadelphia on Walnut Street. We have offices throughout the country and internationally. And we're a full service provider for consulting and market operations services, and we can take projects from their inception all the way through settlements and billing. We have a 24-hour market operations center based in Philadelphia with a fully functional backup center in Indiana. In addition to managing over 6,000 megawatts of generation load and demand response, Customized Energy Solutions also manages over 140 megawatts of advanced energy storage resources in California, ISO New England, New York ISO, PJM, and IESO in Ontario, Canada. And our practical experience with this day-to-day operation of energy storage facilities in competitive energy markets, I think it really provides our team a base that sets us apart from other consulting companies. And our emerging tech team, some of my colleagues who are on the call today, Mike and Patrick, and we have a whole team of us, we've combined our deep knowledge of new technologies with our understanding of market designs, both wholesale and retail, so that we can provide numerous valuable consulting products to help our clients understand the value proposition of energy storage and the market rules for implementation. Our team is now a leader in the global storage arena. We operate the India Energy Storage Alliance, and we're part of the global storage community. We've authored influential reports to help put energy storage on a level playing field. And with ambitious growth targets for energy storage in North America and worldwide, we're glad to be leaders in this space. I'll turn it back over to Mike because of our impact on Order 841 and how it came to be.
Great, thanks, Jackie. So before we talk about the FERC order, I just want to give a little background about FERC and wholesale electricity markets to make sure everybody understands the context for this. So FERC is an acronym for the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, and that's an independent agency for the United States that regulates the interstate transmission and wholesale sales of electricity. So it's really important to know that we're talking about wholesale electricity markets here, not the retail electricity markets that's regulated by state public utility commissions. Now, FERC has jurisdiction over all these wholesale markets for electricity. Some of those markets are organized and operated by ISOs and RTOs, or independent system operators and regional transmission organizations. And this map shows those regions of US and Canada that are covered by those ISOs and RTOs. And there is a difference between an ISO and an RTO. And if you can grab me at a conference, I'll be happy to explain that to you over a drink. Now, the ISOs and RTOs cover 2/3 of North America by load, and their functions include grid operation, market administration, power system planning. And what we're talking about here is FERC issuing an order that is targeting the rules for those ISOs and RTOs, and it's really specific to the market participation for energy storage resources. Now, before we get into Order 841, I just wanted to mention that there were a number of other FERC orders that are very important for the development of energy storage resources. I start the history at Order 890, which really enabled non-generator resources, including advanced energy storage resources, to participate in these ISO RTO markets. But that was really focused on the ancillary service markets, and all the way down to FERC Order 842, issued at the same time as Order 841, which has some very specific rules to enable energy storage resources to participate while they are providing primary frequency response. So now a little bit about the history, the procedural history for Order 841. It really started a little over 2 years ago when the energy storage industry started discussions with FERC, FERC commissioners, and FERC staff. There was a panel at a FERC open meeting. There was an administrative proceeding. There was data requests to the ISOs and RTOs. Stakeholders submitted comments. FERC decided to start a rulemaking proceeding, issue a proposed rulemaking, again accept comments, and then they decided to issue this final rule in February of this year. So now we'll talk about what the order says and then what it should do. So what it says is it directs these RTOs and ISOs to establish a participation model. And in the next slides, we'll talk about what that means. It's focused on electric storage resources, so not resources that store thermal energy. It's really focused on storage of electricity, and it really recognizes that their physical and operational characteristics have to be taken into account in order to level the playing field. So there's 5 different types of discussion and issues in this order. That's about 300 pages, but these are, you could sort of break it down into these 5 topics. And it sets a timeline for these rule changes to go into place. And it's basically about a year from the end of this year. So now, what is a participation model? That is a set of market rules, and by that it's tariff language, but it's also going to be the operating manuals, business practice manuals, and the software that underlines all this market operation that is going to enable the participation of these storage resources. And it has to recognize their unique physical and operational characteristics. And again, this is really targeting the RTO and ISO markets. At the bottom of the slide, there are some examples of participation models. And some of these I didn't even know was a thing, but yes, these are a thing in that these ISOs have different ways that different types of resources can participate and can access the markets. So you see there's lots of acronyms and lots of different types of participation models. And this is how resources with different technologies, prime movers, fuel sources, access these ISO markets. Now, what should Order 841 do? It's really meant to facilitate the full participation of these storage resources in these ISO markets. And how it will do that is it makes it clear that storage resources are eligible to provide all the market products that they're technically capable of. And there's a lot of market products beyond just the concept of electricity. There's capacity, energy, and ancillary services like frequency regulation or contingency reserves. So that's really a key feature of this order. Now it says that storage resources have to be able to be dispatched and can set the wholesale market prices as both a wholesale seller and a wholesale buyer. And this really recognizes their unique capability of being a seller and a buyer, of injecting and withdrawing, of charging and discharging. Now, it also requires that the RTOs and ISOs account for these unique physical and operational characteristics through either bidding parameters or some other means. So when a resource goes to participate in the market, they submit a bid, and a bid really can have a lot of different pieces of information. And that's one way that these markets can take into account the special characteristics of storage resources. Also, the minimum size requirements cannot exceed 100 kilowatts. And this really recognizes that there are more distributed energy resources and distributed storage resources able to participate, but there have been barriers because of minimum size requirements. And then storage resources shall pay wholesale LMP or locational marginal prices for the energy that they charge with. And that's really to distinguish it from paying retail electricity rates. And it's important to note that this order gives a lot of flexibility to the RTOs and ISOs in order to how to implement all of these features. So just a couple excerpts from the order. Really, FERC wanted to remove barriers to the participation of these resources, to enhance competition, to ensure just and reasonable rates, and really noted that the participation of these resources will help the resilience of the bulk power system. So now we'll give some examples about what this means. And first, I'll turn it over to my colleague, Jackie, to talk about California.
All righty, thank you, Mike. Let's see, did the slides forward? Here we go. I'll just keep talking. In California, the California ISO realized early on that advanced energy storage has unique operating characteristics and that it can behave as a flexible resource. Obviously very important with the tremendous amount of renewable integration in California. So participation models are already in place for energy storage to participate both in front of and behind the meter. There's also rules for aggregations, and there's rules already for hybrid resource participation. Energy storage in California can already participate in the day-ahead energy, the real-time energy markets. They can participate in the ancillary service markets, spin, non-spin regulation, and ramp. And there are rules for participation in the CPUC jurisdictional resource adequacy market, which overlaps and integrates with the ISO market design in terms of the offer obligations and the availability incentives and penalties. So really, since 2012, the ISO has classified energy storage as NGRs, non-generator resources. And within the NGR model, the ISO it models the parameters for energy storage to allow resources to be bid and co-optimized, dispatched, and settled in the various markets that I just mentioned. I should have the NGR slide up, but it's on the PDR, but that's okay. You guys know what I'm talking about. So specifically, the ISO includes parameters for...
If you click on the slide, it should activate the keyboard and mouse control. There you go. You've got it.
Thanks, Sam.
Sure. Sorry to interrupt.
Oh, I'm back. Hello. So the ISO does not model the maximum and minimum capacity, which represents the resource's potential to inject or withdraw at a sustainable rate. The megawatt hour parameters are used to keep the ISO market dispatches and regulation control signals within the resource's energy capability range. The ISO uses energy limits and stated charge values to co-optimize the NGR resource over multiple intervals in the ISO markets. And the ISO also uses those stated charge values to prevent infeasible dispatches or control signals. So I would also point out that the model does not have minimum load operating points, state configurations, forbidden operating regions, startup, shutdown, minimum load, or transition costs. Now, some of these topics are being readdressed, such as commitment costs and use limitations. The design evolves in California. There's been numerous stakeholder initiatives over the years to enhance the NGR design, and we refer to that often as the ESDR, Energy Storage Distributed Energy Resource Stakeholder Initiative, and they're in their third stage of that. But there's other market initiatives at the California ISO that also impact the energy storage participation, having to do with resource adequacy implementation, as well as commitment costs. PDRs, proxy demand resources. That's another way for energy storage to participate. And really, this is the wholesale demand response market design, but it applies to energy storage. They've already thought about how does energy storage participate in the wholesale markets from behind the meter, not just a typical load reduction, but energy storage resources. So a little bit about that. A proxy demand resource can be 1/10 of a megawatt. PDR cannot yet export onto the grid, so they can't provide regulation service at this time. However, they still can participate in the energy and other ancillary service markets, meaning the spin and non-spin, and can provide the ramping product as well. There is a 1/2 megawatt requirement for ancillary services by PDRs, and PDRs can be a single site or comprised of aggregations or sub-resources. And the difference between a PDR settlement and an NGR is that a PDR is done with a baseline calculation. I can go into that, but I know we have limited time and we want to talk about 841. But just want to be clear that there are specific characteristics of the baseline for energy storage. And those rules, again, are evolving in the ESDR 3 stakeholder initiative. So the California ISO, with regard to 841, the ISO did file for clarification or rehearing on 3 specific issues. These are not major issues, but they are relevant and important. So the ruling states that it would require each RTO and ISO to directly meter electric storage resources so that all energy entering and exiting the resources is measured by that meter. Well, the California ISO doesn't necessarily require all resources to be metered directly by the California ISO. Their metering rules have evolved to provide more flexibility. So they want to make sure that it's not the ISO that has to meter the resource, that it just has somebody has to meter the resource. Secondly, another issue that the ISO brought up, they agree that resources should not be required to pay both the wholesale and the retail price for the same charging energy, because obviously that would create market inefficiencies due to a double payment. However, it's not very clear how this is determined, because the order says that the host distribution utility, when it's unavailable due to a lack of necessary metering infrastructure and accounting practices, or unwilling to net out the energy purchases associated with the resource, that at that point the ISO really wants to clarify, how do you verify this, or that when an ISO or RTO cannot verify that the host distribution utility has reticence, that they can either require the storage resource to use a participation model designed for retail participation, such as wholesale demand response, or continue settling the storage resource's charging demand under the wholesale LMP. So those are some clarifications that the ISO has asked for, and absent that, that the ISO can require storage resources to resolve retail double billing issues with their retail energy provider as a condition of wholesale market participation. So I guess looking at this, the ISO has said that they will communicate with stakeholders to determine what the compliance issues will be. There's not too many in California, because California really is ahead of the game in terms of integrating energy storage into its market. So in looking at what's in place today and what would need to be done to comply, it appears from our view that the ISO would need to first lower the minimum size threshold for non-generator resources from 0.5 megawatt to 100 kilowatts. Another issue is that some stakeholders have brought up in communications in the ESDR 3 stakeholder initiative. Some stakeholders need that there needs to be settlement mechanisms created to reflect applicable local regulatory authority auxiliary power rules, while also avoiding double payment concerns of behind-the-meter exporting energy storage systems. And what this means is a behind-the-meter storage system that charges for later resale through an export. Sometimes it's not quite clear how that's done, because there could be wholesale charging for the behind-the-meter resource that would be settled at wholesale, but there still could be a retail meter that's spinning and incurring retail costs. So the issue is that settlement systems and rules need to reconcile and remove those wholesale effects from the retail meter settlement, since these transactions are settled at wholesale, and that a defined methodology really needs to be created for designating which charging energy was discharged for wholesale versus retail purposes. The behind-the-meter storage bill needs to net out the retail charges for wholesale, and the wholesale needs to net out the wholesale charges that were used for retail. And then there's some concern that the station power rules, while California has very advanced station power rules and clarifications that are in place through CPUC decisions, that there's still a bit of ambiguity between the on-site building load and the station power load in terms of what's constituted as station power. So these are things that are really in the weeds, but there are stakeholders that have sought refinements on these issues, and they could come up in the compliance for California ISO. So I'm going to turn it back over to my colleagues to talk about other regions now. That was all I have for California. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Jackie. This is Patrick Shoop. I'm going to jump from California into New York ISO. New York is similar in a sense in that it is ahead of the game on energy storage, market rules, and deployment, although it's not particularly as advanced as California, at least traditionally. But New York has become one of the big hot opportunities for energy storage participation, and they already had a couple of programs that were underway at the ISO before FERC's order that would have been establishing better options for energy storage. But first, a little history on storage in New York at the ISO. Since the beginning of the ISO, there has been an asset class called an energy limited resource. This was created for hydro pump storage. It allowed these resources to provide any product, including capacity, as long as they have 4 hours or more of duration. And essentially what it will allow a battery storage resource to do if it files under this asset type is participate like a pump storage resource. So it would schedule its charging and discharging and would be able to provide ancillary services, energy, and capacity with that 4 hours of duration. So this already exists, and NISO had taken steps in the last couple of years to clarify that it is open to battery and other types of advanced storage as well. And this was well before FERC Order 841. Next, NISO has also created a resource type called the Limited Energy Storage Resource. They created this back in 2009 specifically for short duration energy storage resources. So they already had the ELR for 4 hour plus resources. This was created for resources with under 1 hour of duration. As long as they were 1 megawatt, but less than 1 hour of complete duration, that is the ability to sustain charge or discharge for an hour or less, resources could participate in the regulation market as limited energy storage resources. And NISO will manage that state of charge of that resource so that even though it has less than an hour of availability, it will be able to provide regulation to NISO for multiple hours in a row, since they keep it from filling up completely or emptying completely. So it's a good asset type for very short duration resources that just want to provide regulation. Some other provisions include things like being able to settle the net energy used at wholesale market prices rather than retail prices. It is currently only being used by one resource. That's a 20 megawatt flywheel that's been in operation since 2011. So those are both for resources that are operating in front of the meter. There are multiple programs in New York ISO that also allow behind the meter resources to participate in wholesale programs. I won't go into all of those, but there are options that allow storage as well as demand reduction and behind the meter generators to provide energy, capacity, and ancillary services as long as they are not injecting onto the wholesale market. So moving forward to what NISO is doing now, both New York State and FERC have expressed this interest in energy storage. New York State has been leading the charge for more distributed resources to enter the market. It's also been pushing for a higher renewable standard. They now are trying to get to 50% renewable energy by 2030. So kind of a combination of factors have pushed the ISO to start thinking about storage in a more comprehensive sense. And because of that, they were able to get a head start on compliance for 841 by working to create a new storage resource type before the order even came out. So in 2016, NISO started creating this new type of resource they're calling the energy storage resource. Unlike the other resource types, which are rather fragmented and only apply to a specific subset of the total range of storage projects that can be deployed, the energy storage resource is sort of meant to be an all-inclusive asset type, encompassing individual resources as well as aggregated storage resources. It is meant to include resources that are of any particular duration, so no maximum or minimum duration. It will include new bidding parameters and allow resources to report their state of charge to the ISO so that they don't get infeasible dispatches. It will add ISO-controlled optimization in the second phase of this program's deployment. So that means that the ISO will let storage resources hand off control to the ISO and let it schedule them for their maximum economic impact and benefit. So this resource type had been under discussion at the ISO before 841. In fact, it had already been considered before the guidance and FERC's notice of proposed rulemaking in 80-1623, which preceded 841. But once FERC came out with this guidance, NISO adjusted their plans and applied what they saw FERC recommending to this new storage type. At the same time, they're also working on a DER roadmap, creating a new type of dispatchable DER resource. This is for aggregations of behind-the-meter resources that are what NISO is calling heterogeneous, so resources that are composed of multiple individual resources of different types. It's meant to create a generator-like resource from these DERs. And many aspects of this also followed the guidance in 80-1623. NISO is moving ahead with this, even though FERC has not yet held the technical conference or issued a ruling on the DER side of this proceeding. So this is theoretically going to have NISO in compliance with FERC if they do issue a second half of their ruling on DERs on top of what they've already ruled for energy storage. So one last note in New York ISO on the compliance, even though they do have these programs that are underway that are appearing to be fairly compliant with 841 already, and would suggest that New York is well on its way to being one of the first ISOs to have a compliant program designed. There are potential issues. One is the deployment timeline. Despite New York ISO starting earlier than other ISOs on the ESR design, they still say that they are not going to deploy it until sometime in 2020, and this really could slip until 2021. So timing could remain problematic for the ISO's compliance. And then another issue is that even though New York is saying that the ESR resources will be open to anything over 100 kilowatts, some features of the design are only allowed for resources that are greater than or equal to 1 megawatt in total size. These include state of charge monitoring and consideration for dispatch. And there's been discussion about only allowing ancillary services from ESRs that are greater than 1 megawatt. So these limitations could run up against issues since New York is potentially not going to allow resources under 1 megawatt to do everything that larger resources would be able to do, and FERC has wanted 100 kilowatts across the board. And then lastly, NISO is proposing restricting ancillary services to the DER resources that is creating as well for resources that are under 1 megawatt. And so even though that's not part of 841, that could be part of a related future ruling by FERC. So with that, I'll hand it back to Mike, who will discuss the implications for ISO New England.
Great, thanks, Patrick. So for ISO New England, a little bit of history and where we are now. There have been alternative technologies, including advanced energy storage technologies like flywheels and batteries, thermal storage resources, demand response, participating in the market, but it was a pilot program for a while. Then rules were created for alternative technologies to provide frequency regulation. And so the ATRR is a participation model for storage, but it really just guarantees full participation in the frequency regulation market. And so storage resources really have to register as both a generator resource and as a load resource in order to fully participate in the ISO market. And that's really what's at the core of FERC requiring a participation model for electric storage resources. And some of the best practices and examples is like what you heard in California for the non-generator resource, because that's one asset class, one registration form you have to fill out in order to have access to the markets as opposed to having to fill out a generator form and a load form. And so the idea really is to enable full participation and the full optimization, the full utilization of a storage resource. And the storage industry has said really the best practice is to have a single asset registration class that enables participation in all of the market products and not just one, like frequency regulation, which historically had been the target application for a lot of storage resources. Now in ISO New England, there's lots of options for storage resources in terms of the asset types that they register as, in terms of their energy settlement. There has been hydro pump storage resources operating in ISO New England for a while, and there were some enhancements for their bidding parameters last year. Also, ISO New England provided a number of white papers and training material over the last couple of years just to explain all of these different options to developers of storage resources. But also, there's still more to be done. There has been some changes to the frequency regulation market and an acknowledgement that newer storage technologies may have different capabilities and needs from the traditional hydro pump storage resources. So ISO New England has planned on having stakeholder discussions around what other enhancements might be needed. The next one is really going to be focusing on dispatchability. And in some sense, being dispatchable is how you can fully provide energy, the product of energy in ISO markets. But on the flip side, the more requirements that are assessed on resources, including energy storage resources, that might be seen as a negative if that really limits options. So that's something that the discussion will be starting soon. Another big issue in ISO New England is the forward capacity market. And it's been determined that a storage resource can qualify to provide capacity with a 1 hour or 2 hour audit. But really the key is that the performance requirement is called pay for performance, in that as long as the ISO needs energy, it will call on the resource to provide energy. And if you are a limited energy resource, like a battery or a flywheel, you may run out of energy, and then you would be subject to non-performance penalties. And so FERC Order 841 did not require ISO New England or the other markets with these capacity performance markets to change the rules. So those pay for performance rules still apply even to limited energy storage resources. Also, ISO New England has done some other work to enhance the capacity market, what's been known as the IMAP process, and recently had some regulatory ruling for the CASPR, or competitive auctions with sponsored policy resources. And this is interesting in sort of envisioning is a future where a storage resource may be a sponsored policy resource, sort of in a similar fashion that a number of clean technology resources would be considered examples of sponsored policy resources from some states. Also, on the demand response side, there are plans to enhance the participation through price responsive demand, and all of these enhancements are planning to go online this summer. Also, ISO New England has had some discussions over their challenges for ramping, and have had discussions over a ramping product or multi-interval dispatch and pricing. So really, there's a number of similar but different rules in ISO New England to the other ISOs, and it really has them in different levels of compliance with the different parts of Order 841. Specifically, it's most obvious that ISO New England would need to lower the minimum size requirement from 1 megawatt down to 100 kilowatts to be in compliance with the order. What is not so obvious is whether and how ISO New England would need to change or create new participation models to meet the letter of the order in terms of having storage resources have a participation model that allows their full participation. And that includes making sure there are bidding parameters that take advantage of these electric storage resources, including newer technologies, allowing them to manage their own state of charge, allowing them to settle energy at the locational marginal price to distinguish that from the zonal energy price, knowing that storage resources should not be charged transmission charges when they're dispatched by the ISO to consume energy, and also the metering and accounting practices to enable and monitor all of this participation and energy accounting. So really, I would say there's a lot that is uncertain in ISO New England and many other ISOs in terms of what will be considered an acceptable filing to comply with Order 841. And a lot of that comes from the large amount of flexibility that FERC has left to the ISOs in its issuance of the order. So now we'll talk about Order 841 next steps. First, I will mention that as we heard with California ISO, a dozen other entities have filed requests for clarification and rehearing. A lot of these really have to do with the issue of distributed energy resource and the jurisdiction between FERC and state regulatory entities. So FERC has to acknowledge these in order for them not be denied. So that deadline will be in mid-April. Some of the requesters were like California ISO, and they are other ISOs just looking for clarification. Also, all the ISOs, so the three that we discussed in more detail here, and the other ones will have to make some filing to FERC. They will have some sort of stakeholder process to inform stakeholders of what's going on. And to be clear, all the ISOs will have to make some changes to comply with Order 841. ISOs will file their tariffs by the end of this year, and then implementation is due 1 year from that. So that's it for our prepared material. Thank you very much, and we're happy to answer questions.
Great, thanks very much to all three of you, and we're going to get as many questions in as we can. This is fascinating, and I mean, we went sort of deep into just three of the ISO/RTO territories. I am assuming that similar conditions apply in SPP, MISO, PJM, and I guess ERCOT isn't technically regulated. But what about the rest of the country? You mentioned that these ISOs and RTOs cover 2/3 of the country by load. I think it's even less than that by geographical territory. We have some folks asking what happens to the markets in other places.
Yeah, great question. I'll start, and then my colleagues can jump in too. So certainly, FERC's order and this proceeding was really focused on the jurisdictional ISO market. So it's those 6 ISO regions in the U.S., not ERCOT, which is not under FERC jurisdiction. But certainly, it's relevant to and will help the markets for storage outside of those regions. And really one way is it'll allow people to have more experience with energy storage. It'll provide more opportunities for these newer storage technologies to get developed, because it'll increase those opportunities, those revenue potential in these regions, and more entities will develop more projects. And then those entities and those applications can be translated outside of those ISO regions. Jackie or Patrick, did you want to add anything?
Sure. Hi, this is Jackie. And so, yes, I think that there will be an impact on non-FERC jurisdictional areas and organizations, because really the value proposition for energy storage really comes true when we talk about multiple use applications. So when a resource is that behind the meter, there needs to be a lot of effort to develop rules for multiple use applications, to define methodologies for designating the energy that's being used for charging, whether it's retail or wholesale, and if it's going to be used, reused. So the behind the meter storage customer's bill is going to need to net out retail charges for wholesale, and the wholesale needs to net out the charges for retail consumption. The point is that there's going to be a lot more overlap. So state and wholesale regulatory bodies are going to have to coordinate. And a lot of this is now being done in California, but we can see it becomes very complex. But I think once these rules get developed, it'll be really cool, because then storage can really achieve its full value proposition.
Well, Jackie, thank you for that. I'm glad you brought up behind the meter storage. We actually have a question about that. For commercial customers who are considering solar and storage systems behind the meter, between 100 kilowatts to a half a megawatt or so, how relevant is this order in opening up wholesale markets and in terms of making an economic case for the investment? In other words, as a behind the meter resource, will you be better able to sell energy services into these markets, or is this a case where aggregation, which really isn't touched on in 841, FERC sort of put it off for a future order, is going to be needed?
Mike or Patrick, do you want to do that one?
Yeah, I'll start, and others can jump in. So that's a good point, Todd, that this order really, I think, has more focus on front of the meter resources. However, there are a number of provisions that will apply to resources regardless of where they are connected. One participation model that has existed and that FERC acknowledges continues to exist for storage resources is the demand response participation model. And that really has been used, and I think will continue to be used by developers of supply resources, be a battery or a fossil generator behind a retail meter, and they can participate in these ISO markets as a demand response resource. So you fill out a registration form for DR, and you can provide capacity energy and ancillary services in the ISO markets if you want. So that participation model continues to be an option. Order 841 really provides even more opportunities if you're building a storage resource in front of the meter. However, some provisions like the minimum size requirement of 100 kilowatts really can benefit resources across the board, because it just lowers that threshold.
Right. So that's a good point. So we're looking at lowering the threshold for participation down to 100 kilowatts, and it's been much higher in some areas, a megawatt or even more. Even given that, though, if you are, say, looking at installing a 60 kilowatt battery at a commercial facility behind your meter, you're still going to need to deal with an aggregator, correct?
It is going to depend region to region, but right, generally there is some entity that will provide that role of an aggregator, whether there is just one resource or a number of resources involved. But right, that's true. But you also made a good point that really the issues around aggregation of resources and smaller resources and resources behind the meter, most of those issues were not addressed in this order and were and are going to be taken up in a separate proceeding, the Distributed Energy Resource proceeding, and there is a technical conference scheduled next week, 2 days. That's really the first step in that new proceeding, and then there's likely to be comments and a whole nother regulatory proceeding around that, because there was a lot of issues and a lot of disagreement across stakeholders that FERC received in the comments on this other proceeding.
Great, great. So I also want to ask, and this is something that we also have a question from a participant here. You mentioned that there is flexibility built into this FERC Order 841, and so flexibility usually means that the regulated parties have some leeway in how to interpret or to implement the requirements. What is your take on that, and what's the potential for different ISOs and RTOs to really come to a different outcome by just exercising that flexibility?
Yeah, that's a good question. So certainly, even with less flexibility, ISOs do have some leeway to implement FERC regulations different ways. We've seen this with a number of markets. A lot of folks in the storage industry will be familiar with the difference in the frequency regulation market designs across the jurisdictional ISOs. But similar here, that even in the areas where there is more specificity from FERC, ISOs just have different rules, different environments, different stakeholders and stakeholder processes, and their tariffs look different, and their manuals and their software will be different. But it is important to note that FERC did leave a lot of flexibility on a lot of the really important items, just really not going beyond just saying that you need to have a participation model, you need to account for the physical and operating characteristics through bidding parameters or other means. Now, FERC did list what those parameters should be, what those issues and characteristics will be that have to be taken into account, but exactly how they're taken into account, how much detail around them, how much flexibility the resource owner has in identifying them or changing those values, really that's all left up to the ISO. So certainly we'll continue to see some differences across ISOs, but at the same time, really the spirit of Order 841 is to ensure a level playing field, and that these storage resources can be utilized to the best of their ability and to the most benefit to the consumer.
Hey, Mike, I would just add too, in California, the PDR model does enable energy storage to participate from behind the meter. So stakeholders are looking at 841, and compliance, and trying to encourage their position through the ESDR 3 stakeholder initiative, so that charging energy from behind the meter energy storage that's resold for wholesale purposes would need to be charged wholesale instead of retail rates. So they are looking at that behind the meter issue and trying to say to the California ISO that this is a wholesale product, and this needs to be addressed as part of 841 compliance. Whether the ISO will agree to that, it's not clear yet, but that is definitely an issue that those behind the meter resources are bringing up. And perhaps those behind the meter resources could be modeled as NGRs instead of PDRs if the rules were done in a way that the settlement systems are created to identify when that charging energy should be wholesale or retail. So I just wanted to mention that.
Thank you. So we have come to the end of the hour, but don't hang up, because we are empowered to expand the hour and stretch time a little bit, and we're gonna go on and see if we can get to just a few more questions before we end the webinar, because we do have quite a few, and we'd like to get to as many as we can. So just a basic question that maybe we skipped over it, but somebody wanted to know, does electricity storage include compressed air energy storage? It might be a good idea to just sort of go over what is included under 841.
Yeah, great question. So FERC did provide a description of what they meant, what they mean when they say electric storage resource. And it is a resource that can take in electricity, store it, and then provide electricity to the grid. And some examples of technologies would be hydro pump storage, compressed air, batteries, and flywheels. So those are all examples of electric storage resources, and those all should be in mind when the ISOs are designing these rules to comply with this order.
Great. Somebody wants to know, how does energy storage participate in the reserve markets? And then they say in parentheses, synchronize and primary.
Right, that's a good question, and if we could, have more time to go over the rules in each ISO market, you'll see that the rules differ for the level of ability to participate or prohibitions on participation of storage resources in those reserve markets for spinning or synchronized reserve and non-spinning or non-synchronized reserve. But it is possible in some regions. It is not allowed in other regions, and that's really the core of a lot of this order, is to make sure that storage resources that are technically capable of providing that service, which on some level is, well, you have to have enough duration to be able to respond to a reserve event for as long as the ISO needs that energy. And if you can be technically capable in that sense, then there's no reason you should not be allowed to offer that service or provide that service just because you have a newer technology than some of the other traditional generation resources.
Great, thank you. Here's another specific question having to do with the California ISO NGR. And the question is, what is the minimum increment value that the storage system can bid in for wholesale energy, ancillary services, and capacity under 841?
I'll have to get back to you on that in a few minutes. Be right back on that one.
Okay.
Can you go to the next one, Todd?
Sure. All right, this is a rather long one. I'm going to see if I can sort of summarize and condense. The question is, FERC allows flexibility to RTOs and ISOs. Do you think that this will encourage cooperation and coordination between RTOs and ISOs with distribution utilities and state regulatory authorities? And then basically the questioner is asking whether this will encourage this cooperation between the regulators, the state agencies, and the utilities in order to harmonize the ways in which transactions are metered and accounted for. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I would say absolutely this order will move the ball forward in that court in terms of requiring, really motivating the operators of the wholesale markets and the regulatory agencies and the owners of the retail distribution systems, the utilities, to work together to really make sure that the accounting, metering, monitoring, sharing of information really helps the system work better, helps that these storage resources are not double charged for energy, so that when they charge a kilowatt hour, they're not paying wholesale rates to the ISO and retail rates to the utility for the same kilowatt hour, and really enabling that requires collaboration, coordination, sharing of information. But at the same time, I think the other docket, the distributed energy resource docket, really is where those issues will be explored much more fully.
Great. So I have a question.
This is Jackie.
Oh, okay. Hi,
hey.
Jackie.
Hi, I was just going to chime in with the answer to the previous question. I wanted to check with our wholesale market operation team to see what the smallest increment of bids that we've submitted, and we've gone down to 10 kilowatts. So that's an answer to that earlier question. Thank you.
That's low. That's small. Okay.
Yes.
Interesting. Thank you. So I was just about to ask on the along the lines of the opportunity that's being created here through this order and through all the implementation and dockets and so forth that are going to be going forward on this. What is the scale of the opportunity? What are we talking about? I mean, I know that it's, if you look at a single market like frequency regulation in PJM, for example, it was a finite market. Everyone knew that it would be saturated at some point. It was kind of easy to define. We're talking about how many millions of dollars or how many megawatts before that market kind of gets saturated. What are we talking about here across the entire all the ISO RTO regions and all the various services that can be provided by storage now under this new FERC order? What's the size of this opportunity? Has anybody kind of figured that out?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll start, and then Jackie and Patrick, feel free to jump in. So to start and provide a baseline, we count about 500 megawatts of these advanced or newer technologies, sort of batteries and flywheels, currently operating in these North American ISO markets. And the potential, the economic potential, not just the physical potential, because these ISO markets procure terawatts of power, but really the economic potential we see on the order of gigawatts. So that's really the potential just in these ISO markets. It's really enabled by this FERC order, because that means storage resources are going to be participating in capacity and energy and ancillary service markets, and possibly in addition to other applications in terms of saving customer bills or deferring transmission and distribution investment. And so we really see it on the order of multiple gigawatts.
Great. Well, so thanks everyone. We've extended our hour an extra 10 minutes, and I think that we need to wrap this up. I appreciate the willingness of our presenters to stay with us a little extra time. I think it was worthwhile to get to some additional questions. Thank you to Mike Berlinski, Jacqueline, DeRosa, and Patrick Shoop at Customized Energy Solutions. I'm Todd Berlinski-Paul with Clean Energy States Alliance, and thanks to everybody who joined us. I'm going to hand this back over to Samantha to tell you about how you can get copies of the slides or review the entire webinar, and also additional webinars that are upcoming.
Great, thanks, Todd. And thank you to everybody for attending the webinar today. So on your screen right now, you should see some contact info for Todd and for Dan Borneo at Sandia. Feel free to get in touch with them if you have any questions related to today's webinar or to the STap project. If you'd like to look up more resources related to the Energy Storage Technology Advancement Partnership, you can visit the STap website. There is a short link to it. And you can also browse our website for an archive of this webinar and all of our previous webinars. We'll also be sending you a follow-up email with a link to all of the webinar materials. So that is coming your way. And before you sign off for the day, I want to let you know about a couple of upcoming webinars that we have coming up soon. One in particular might be of interest. The topic is FERC and clean energy. That's taking place on Thursday, April 26th. And on that webinar, we will have John Moore speaking. He is the director of the Sustainable FERC project at NRDC, and he will be discussing some of the issues currently before FERC and the potential threats for state RPSs and related state energy policies. So you can read more about that and sign up at cisa.org/webinars. Also read about another upcoming webinar we have in early May. So we do encourage you to attend those. Thanks again, everybody, for attending today, and we hope to see you at some of these upcoming ones. Bye.